You're first and foremost a sculptor who experiments with various forms of utility. Timekeeping, writing, sitting, reading, contemplating. The concrete chair, the first piece you came to downstairs, is turned backwards so that until you come to the front of it, it reveals itself only at that point as a chair. This gesture of utility is what I'd like for you to comment on and reflect more in depth. So from sketch to sculpture, could you take us through the fabrication process and when the form begins to reveal a use or a function?
Well, there's probably a use in it fairly early, but sometimes I just doodle, and I don't know what that is. It's some squares and some circles, or some ellipses or something, and I'm not really looking for a chair or a table or any particular thing, but if it reveals itself to look like, well, this is promising for a chair, then probably my mind clamps onto that. And then I begin to think about what a chair must be. Obviously, you must sit in it. And as you just heard, one of the things I want is it for it not to reveal itself as a chair until you're clearly in front of it. The back view, the side view may not suggest chair at all. And I would like that to suggest sculpture. That there's things happening here. There's forms, there's volumes, and there's voids, and there's spaces, and there's weight, and there's direction that all come together to make a sculptural form. But if it's going to be a chair, somewhere there's got to be, like you take a scoop out of this thing, and you need an angle in the seat, you need a back, and with the lumbar support, you need enough space to get in there. I seldom upholster things, so my chairs seldom ever have a pillow. So you're sitting on wood or concrete or metal. But if you get the form pretty close, they're comfortable. You wouldn't sit there all day. I don't expect anybody to sit there all day. And they're comfortable. But really, the really important part is what it looks like. And I don't want it to look like a chair. And we were just talking before, we were talking about something that came up today earlier, that why is a chair so important? Well, for us that do sculpture and do chairs, it is clearly so important that there are collectors of chairs. I've never heard of a collector of tables or a collector of cabinets, but chairs offer, because they're intimate. You put your body in it. There's something about a chair that's much more special than any other piece of furniture. And you can do so much more with it. And in tabletop, really it needs to be flat. And flat's not interesting. So the curves are interesting. To me, curves are what things are about. I mean, I love organic things. And sometimes these ideas come from nature because there really isn't anything that I know of much that's flat and square in nature. Things are soft and round, etc. And soft forms, to me, are the kind of forms I like. And it probably came from, they're obviously everybody has influences. And some of my early influences, and maybe some still today, Brancusi's my number one guy. And I probably got more from Brancusi than anybody else, but art and mural come in a pretty close second. And maybe Henry Moore lagging up somewhere behind. And I don't think much about Henry Moore anymore, but I still think about the other three. And then influences come from everywhere. But now I'm getting off the subject.
Well, maybe on the issue of chairs, the rocking chairs, which we have two examples of, they blend the traditional sort of form of a rocking chair, but then it has aesthetic and mechanical references to cars. And as an organic sculpture in its own right, with references to cars, the piece truly is like a form within forms. Could you talk about the goal of the rocking chairs and what they accomplish for you? What's the problem solved that in the rocking chairs?
Well, rocking chairs, I think, are particularly interesting. Number one, they move. The other chairs don't usually move. Sometimes. So, you're always looking for what would be interesting to sort of put your effort into that could become a body of work. And I thought rocking chairs offer this possibility. Number one, they move, and by exaggerating the rockers, you can really have a really interesting form. Because a simple curve, just like this, doesn't do much for you. But if you keep going, in either direction, it gets a great deal more interesting. And if you can loop it around, it gets even more interesting. So that kind of loop form is interesting in itself, even two-dimensionally. But then you start thinking, what we're doing is three-dimensional. So obviously, rocker chairs need two rockers, although I've been experimenting with one rocker chairs, which can be done. You can do that. But so the rockers, the automobile image comes from this, that when well, it probably comes from an early photograph when shutter speeds were very slow, and you photographed a racing car going along in front of you. The wheels looked elliptical because there was enough, the car had moved enough distance during your exposure that the wheels were no longer a perfect circle, they became ellipses. And I have been fond of ellipses my whole life. A quick story. When I was a child, I loved to draw. And like all boys, I think I love to draw cars. And I found that I could do a really good job of drawing a car from the side view, but if I tried to draw a drawing of the car like racing toward me, there were two things I did not understand. I did not know how to draw an ellipse, and I did not know about perspective. But, as I observed more and more things being drawn, I finally figured it out. In college, I had a drawing class that showed me how to do that. But then I think that really what was more influential to me was the way cartoons are drawn. If a cartoonist draws a car that is supposed to be speeding, often it will be speeding toward you. And the wheels will be quite elliptical, and the front of the car will be bigger than the back of the car. Exaggerated perspective. So that's become kind of a universal symbol for speed. So with that in mind, I really tried to focus the rockers in that kind of way. The back end of each rocker is smaller than the front end. That's also a good thing because it's inviting. The opposite would be terrible. So to pitch the back end is really important. And then, you're obviously going to suspend a seat in there somewhere. And the other tricky part with the rockers is they need to, when they're at rest and no one's in them, they need to set in the right position. And then when you put a person in there, they also need to not go back too far or not too far. So you have to try and find that center of balance. I made 10 rocking chairs in this series. One of them did require lead. It didn't balance right. But that, you can put lead in there and fix that. And also the weight of these makes them rock longer than a traditional rocker might rock. If you just stopped pushing, it would probably stop after 1 or 2 rocks. These will rock more than that. And they also have one other automobile reference, that is camber. Old-fashioned racing cars, the front wheels would have a noticeable camber. The bottom of the wheel would be, the wheels aren't sitting square with the ground, they're tipped a little, the front wheels. And I remember when I had an old-fashioned 1949 MG TC, but that's very obvious on it. So I've lived with that car for 50 years. And I remember once when I took it to get inspected at a place that did not know the car at all, they wouldn't pass it because they said the wheels are crooked. But anyway, they're supposed to be that way. So I introduced that in too, but that is also an inviting feature, that by tipping each side out, that's also inviting. The opposite would be terrible. So, but those are kind of thoughts that go through my mind. And I'm doing all this on paper. I'm drawing and drawing and drawing these loops. And when a loop looks good, then I take it a little further. I might draw front view, top view, side view. Keep drawing, drawing, and drawing. That's the way they come about.
You mentioned when a chair might rock and it's not supposed to, or a rocking chair needs some assistance to rock the way it is supposed to. In works that you yourself have described before that may not be the most comfortable to use or aren't as successful in their actual function, are they still successful pieces just from, do you still exhibit them from a design standpoint? It's a successful experiment? Or what are your thoughts on the ones that maybe don't succeed in being the most comfortable?
Well, I will readily admit that some are better than others. And I think that that's important. I mean, it's important to even fail. Because, if you just took the safe path, what's interesting about that? You could find the formula. It wouldn't be too hard to do. If you do it just like this, the balance is perfect, rock's really nice, it's comfortable. But I wouldn't want to work that way. I'd want to start fresh with each one and try to do something different. So, and putting yourself constantly at risk is what's exciting. I mean, it must be that if you're a race car driver, actually going really fast must be exciting. If you only went 20 miles an hour, it wouldn't be any fun. And so always going in this unexplored territory where you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what's next, you hope it works. And you think it'll work, but you haven't done it before. But each one of these rockers is different, even though they have kind of the same vocabulary. There's two here, and they're pretty different. And one I like a lot better than the other one, but I think it was important that I made both of them. Some things are just not going to work out as well as others.
With all your knowledge about making impeccable, meticulous design, what kept you from wanting to focus more on, commercial mass production and focusing more increasingly on a sculptural form or sculptural work and just making great individual one-of-a-kind pieces as opposed to mass producing perfect chairs?
Well, I have done some design for industry. And in fact, I did a collection that even has my name on it. And they're called the Wendell Castle collection. But, you cannot take the kind of risk with that kind of work that you can with the art-oriented work. You really have to sell in a price range that makes sense to customers. You've got to make things that will possibly work with other things in the house. I mean, a lot of my things now are quite oversized. And it would really stick out like a sore thumb in the living room if you're trying to have this coordinated living room where all the colors go together and the sofa painting, has the same colors as your sofa, etc. It would just be totally out of place. So you have a different mindset for designing commercial things. And I'll have to admit, I've tried it. I'm not sure that I'm very good at it, because my mind is really in another place. And I'm wanting to think of the most ridiculous piece of furniture I can think of, and the one that will not possibly fit in your living room. I mean, I do get concerned about things that you probably should go through your door. But I wouldn't worry about something that say, oh, this chair weighs 1,000 pounds. Nobody will ever buy a chair that weighs 1,000 pounds. That's not true. People will buy things that weigh 1,000 pounds. How many times you move your chair anyway? And if you got enough money to buy this chair, you got help. That leads me to the question that
to that, I think of, I initially thought of Salvador Dali's Mae West couch. And the functional objects that you do make that are obviously have elements of fantasy are really successful, and so few artists, I think, have achieved that. I know you've been recognized by the Tiffany Foundation. I mean, he's part of a lineage of people that I think have successfully melded fantasy and furniture and functional works, and even more recently, designers like Alexander McQueen, who it's not so theatrical or cliche, it's not one-dimensional, it's really effective. And you want to take time to explore the piece for all of its use. And number 7 of your 1996 rules of thumb is, if it's offbeat or surprising, it's probably useful. So how do you keep finding unusual ideas to invigorate that practice?
That's easy. It's easy. I don't know why it's easy. And it's something you can't explain. But I think that I see things differently than other people do. And maybe it's because I'm dyslexic, or maybe it's because I have a short attention span. I don't know. But I have no trouble coming up with ideas. In fact, I may have too many. And so, really what it becomes very important to me, and I think a lot about, is editing and decision making. Like, why do I decide this one looks better than that? And try to think about what you're thinking, and why did you think that? And to eliminate any bias from entering into that. So it's about making decisions about ideas more than it is getting ideas. Because, you can get a lot of ideas. Some ideas are good and some ideas are bad. I mean, even if it's an original idea, it might be a bad idea. So it's really, that's the difficult part, is making judgments about editing what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. I mean, I draw on paper, and paper's cheap. And you need to think that everything is cheap. You also need to think that wood is free, or you'd be concerned. So I never heard of a sculptor, for example, that thought, well, I can't make this thing. It's going to be too heavy. It's going to take too much bronze. So on. You have to think that the material is free, so that you are free. You don't think about what that's going to cost. And so you're making all your judgments about the way it looks. And then you have many things to consider. And you begin to narrow them down. And I make models to help me in those final decisions. And I reject a lot of models, even though I spent several days making that model. I decided, well, I'm not going to make that. This other one's better. I can't tell you where you get ideas. I can tell you one, because it's right over here, that I know where that idea came from. You probably all do too. It's Dr. Caligari's field. And many of you have probably seen the film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's about a 1929 German expressionist film. It's a horror film, a silent film. And so everything is very dark in there. And the sets are all kind of crooked. The furniture is all kind of crooked and hard-edged, and things are sliced. And there are broad brush strokes on some of the sets in the background. And I saw that movie when I was in college. And it made a real impression on me, but I never thought about that it could enter my work. Well, it took about 40 years, and it did. And I don't know why that image came back, but for some reason, whether someone mentioned the film or how that happened, I don't remember. But then I did not want to look at the film again, because I wanted this memory to have gone through this osmosis or whatever, has gone into the sponge that's in your brain and mixed up with other things. Because I didn't want it to be purely representative of what was in the film. It was kind of my impression of what's in the film. And that time gave me that. So what was in the film were these kind of jagged, cut, hard-edged things, and this slashing kind of painting, which is a black and white film, so it was black. And that's where that vocabulary came from. And I decided that, well, I'm going to furnish Dr. Caligari's home. So I made him a desk, and I made him a table, and I made him a reading stand, and a wardrobe, and I don't know, a few other things. I more or less furnished his house.
There are classic binaries that I think fit into your work: man and machine, nature and technology. Do you approach or do you process that kind of information when you make work? Like, do you think of conflicting binaries and how can that emerge in one piece?
No, I don't think I think. No, I don't know what I think about when I'm designing. That's a hard question. I mean, maybe because I do believe that the images that are in your mind, and when I told this story about the piano recently, somebody said, well, you must have a photographic memory. Well, I don't have a photographic memory, not in the sense that most people think of photographic memory, but I do remember images. Much better, I couldn't remember a sentence or a number, but I can remember images. And what that means, I don't know. What that's good for.
And also the other day, we were talking about titles, and I know that you hadn't titled much of your early work, but then the more that the number of pieces grew and they had to be differentiated, you started making a list of words that you thought would be nice associations for the type of work that you make. And Cimarron, Topeka, Abilene, areas around Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Do those locations, the original, sort of where you're from, still hold sway over the work you make? And then also this chair here, Nirvana, maybe not a physical place, but a kind of figurative place. Is there a connection there with locations? And
yes, there probably is. I mean, actually the way I work with the names, I don't generally, well, back up. The early pieces didn't have names. It was a table, it was a chair, it was a walnut chair, it was an oak chair. Well, after you made 4 or 5 of those, you get pretty confused, and you can't figure out which one is which. And somebody says, I got your oak chair, and which one? I don't have any idea. So the obvious answer is you name them. And the early names, like for the lamp is Raquel. I did some lamps, and one of them was Benny, and one of them was Raquel, and one of them was Fat Albert, and one was Sluggo, and names like that. But more recently, I'm trying to think of more of kind of abstract and obscure words to throw in there. And what I do is I make lists of potential names. When I'm reading along and reading a novel or whatever, and 2 or 3 words out of context this sounds really interesting. So I'll write those down. And then when I finish the piece, I'll pull out my list and I'll see if any of them sort of seem to fit. The Reaper Rocker back there is like, to me, I had Reaper on my list. And since I was mainly a rocker, I could always stick that on if I wanted to. That I saw it as dark, and I think that pointy hat suggested Reaper, and so that's the Reaper Rocker. So they just come off my list, and I try to keep my list at least 20 or 30 names ahead. And I've got something to go by.
You mentioned this a couple times about that the rockers for you kind of are dark works. I know you recently made a big body of work made of ash, and that earlier we were also talking about that through as your styles have changed and you've experimented with certain lines or certain furniture styles, that every era you've designed in has its own peculiar shapes or lines you think are associated with it. What about this recent work that is so dark, and why do you think, is there dark times?
I don't like to think of myself as being, I'm not a depressed person. But I think that's interesting. And, you know, it's sort of a known fact in people who've studied creativity and cognitive knowledge and things like this, really have discovered that melancholy is beneficial to creativity. That there's been a lot of scientists who've studied this. And I don't know that I am, but that thought is in my mind. And I think that dark work, and I mean dark in both of the sense that they're actually dark, and in the sense that there is an association in the forms that suggests a kind of a darkness. And it's hard to explain, really, but I kind of think of it that way. And what I've been doing, my show that's currently running at the Friedman Bendy Gallery in New York City, everything in the show is black. But there's another reason for black, which I think is happy, that you see forms very purely in black. You know, if you this laminating process that I do, gluing layers together, and it's clearly in the rocking chair, you can see it, even though I picked the walnut as carefully as I could for color, there's differences in color, and you see the laminations. And in a sense, that could be disturbing, that it interrupts the form. So a more pure form would be seen without those kind of interruptions, but I wouldn't want to lose the grain. If I go to all this trouble to make it out of wood instead of plastic, I want it to be known as made out of wood. So certain woods have grains that come through under black, and ash is particularly good at that. And so they're ash, and they're dark. And I see the form very purely that way. And why, I don't know. And whether there's a melancholy aspect to it, maybe. But I doubt it.
We got a chance to talk about the pianos. I do want to talk about the clocks again, and you know, back to a kind of surreal, fantastical association. We've talked about the irregularity and the unconvention of the way our clocks operate, and you know, humans kind of have created our division or our measurements of time. But you, with your clocks, are trying to sort of experiment with irregular, conventional time uses, and that has set about a continuation, I guess, for a while, for quite a few clocks. And we were talking about earlier you having lights and chairs, and the clocks have been and could continue to be one of the bigger numbered forms that you work from. Could you talk about the clocks just a little bit?
I mean, the original idea of actually thinking about clocks, believe it or not, I had never made a clock until the late 70s. And my dealer at that time was Alexander Milliken in New York, and in discussing with him you know, what my next show might be, I suggested, well, there's one piece of furniture that's different than all the other pieces of furniture, because you don't sit in it, you don't put anything on it, you don't put anything in it, you just look at it. And so what's the difference between a grandfather clock and a piece of sculpture? All you do with a piece of sculpture is you look at it. All you do with the grandfather clock is you look at it. So maybe that's the closest piece of furniture to being a sculpture. Actually, I don't believe that's true, but I was thinking that then. I change my ideas and my opinions about my own work frequently. But anyway, we embarked on a project to do grandfather clocks. And only one of them in the whole 11. First it was going to be 12, because that made sense. I thought, you don't want to make sense, so it should be 13. Because there's no reason for 13. But the 13th one was, in my mind at this point, looked the most like a grandfather clock, and was actually not a clock or a grandfather. And I tied a string around it to give it a waist, which I thought made it more like a person. And then I carved it exactly, including the knot and the string and everything, to be like this thing. And bleached, it was mahogany, and bleached all the color out of it so it became nearly white. And then a little bit of the clock showed at the bottom, so I stained that back in with cheap stain to not make it look very good. And to me, that was the most successful clock, because it wasn't a clock. Now, the other clocks were clocks and kept time, but in unusual ways, where we actually made clockworks. Some were based on the old French idea of a mystery clock, and some of them came from all over. But we made 13 of those, which were, it was a pretty good thing. But it's not, in hindsight though, I look back and said, this is probably not what I should have been doing. Because I'm not really a clockmaker. I mean, I used assistants and people to do the clocks. And at some point in time, which came after that, I decided I'm not going to do that anymore. That I won't take advantage of any particular skills that happen to be available to me. I'll only do what I could have done if I had no one in the shop. And I believe that makes it the work much more personal, and it revolves around me. I have assistants at home, of course, but if they had some particular skills that I couldn't possibly do, I'm not going to do that thing. And I think that's kind of important for an artist to make his work as personal and as much as you can, something that I can do, other people don't do.
And sort of one last thought, and then I'd like for anyone else who has questions can certainly ask them. But some theorists refer to their type of art object in our culture that they call super objects, and those objects hold a unique place in our culture. They symbolize this sort of special relationship that we sometimes have with material things. Because some clothes get thrown away, outdated music devices get thrown away, and furniture can even be discarded. But certain objects occasionally emerge that fill the space between daily life and art. And they're held in high regard as examples of how elements of visual art and design are vital to all cultures around the globe. And I think you make super objects. So thank you.